Before we begin, if you're watching here on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive all the mystery and haunted place stories we publish. We also want to know, where are you watching us from today? Comment below. It's always fascinating to see how many people from all over the world follow these enigmatic stories. The house emerged from the fog like a living organism, breathing slowly, its ancient bones creaking with each change in temperature. There were no signs, no curious visitors on that grey morning. Only the distant sound of hammers echoed from somewhere inside the impossible structure, as if someone was still working there, though no one should be. Ethan Hale watched the mansion from the outside, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or ancient legends. He believed in documents, accounting records, unresolved inheritances, and human errors that spanned generations. And yet, something about that building bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. The property had come to him through a cold, bureaucratic process. A forgotten inventory, a distant lineage, a name repeated on yellowed papers. No emotional letter, no farewell, just the transfer of ownership of a house that nobody wanted to keep. Winchester House wasn't just big, it was excessive. Corridors that ended in walls, staircases that led to the ceiling, doors that opened onto emptiness. All of that was known, recorded, explained in tourist books. What wasn't in any guidebook were the parallel records hidden in local archives, unexplained domestic accidents, employees who abandoned their jobs without notice, relatives who died too young, always inside or around that house. Ethan wasn't there out of curiosity. He was there out of necessity. After losing his job at an auditing firm in San Francisco, his only option had been to accept the unlikely inheritance from a distant relative he barely remembered. The condition was simple: take over the house, verify old documents stored inside, and get everything in order for a future sale. A technical job, cold, temporary. But there was an obstacle: Margaret Lowell. She was in charge of the city's historical archive, and according to municipal records, the only person authorized to grant full access to the property's documents. Unlike Ethan, Margaret believed that some things should not be touched, nor sold, nor explained. She had known the house since she was a child. She had grown up hearing whispered stories, seeing relatives avoid the place, noticing how certain names were always pronounced in a low tone. For her, Winchester House was not just an eccentric building, it was a mistake that had never been corrected. When Ethan stepped through the front door, he immediately felt the air change. It wasn't his imagination. The smell of old wood mixed with something metallic betrayed decades of unfinished renovations. The floor creaked under his footsteps, not as a warning, but as a reaction. He didn't speak. He just walked. The walls were covered in obsessive details, repeated carvings, discreetly engraved numbers, symbols that seemed out of place in their architectural context. Light streamed in through stained glass windows, casting shadows that moved slowly as the day progressed, creating the sensation that the house was never completely still. In one of the central hallways, Ethan found something that hadn't been mentioned in any report: marks on the baseboard, as if heavy furniture had been repeatedly dragged to the same spot. The pattern repeated itself on other floors, always converging inwards, never outwards. Meanwhile, Margaret watched from afar, outside, leaning against her old car. She knew exactly when someone was beginning to understand that this house didn't function like the others. She didn't evict. She didn't threaten. She was just testing the waters. Inside the main office, Ethan found boxes of documents that had never been catalogued. Letters without return addresses, lists of names crossed out by hand, records of absurd expenses for renovations that made no practical sense. Everything pointed not to luxury, but to urgency. Organized fear. The name Winchester appeared repeatedly, but not as a symbol of power. It was associated with losses, interruptions, premature deaths, children, employees. Distant relatives. Ethan felt a growing unease, not supernatural, but profoundly human. The feeling that this family had tried to build something to contain something else, something that was never named in the official documents. When he left the room, the sound of hammering stopped. For the first time since his arrival, the house was completely silent. And it was at that moment that Ethan realized this was not an abandoned place. It was a place that had never finished telling its story. Winchester House didn't reveal itself all at once. It presented itself in layers, as if each corridor demanded a different kind of attention. Ethan realized this within the first few hours inside the house. It wasn't enough to observe. It was necessary to learn to navigate, to recognize patterns, to accept that common logic failed there. The interior appeared to have been expanded impulsively, not by planning. Some rooms were excessively ornate, while others remained unfinished, with exposed floorboards and marks from old tools. In certain places, the wallpaper concealed sealed doors, detectable only by small irregularities on the surface. There was no sign of vandalism or recent neglect. Everything indicated that the house had been maintained exactly as it had been left. Ethan began to meticulously record everything, almost obsessively. He photographed numbers carved into beams, repeated symbols on handrails, interior windows that led nowhere. In various places, the number 13 appeared disguised in geometric patterns, never explicit, always fragmented. It didn't seem like decorative superstition. It seemed like instruction. Outside, the city maintained an ambiguous relationship with the property. Older merchants avoided commenting on the matter. Younger residents treated the house as a distant tourist attraction, something folkloric, devoid of real impact. But in the municipal archives, Margaret knew another version of the story. She had dedicated years to organizing documents that no one requested. Death records, minutes from emergency meetings, unanswered letters. The name Winchester always came up, accompanied by administrative silence. There were no in-depth investigations, only quick closures. Cases filed away before questions were even asked. Margaret remembered the first time she entered the house as a child, accompanying her father, who did occasional maintenance work. He never allowed her to wander off. He never climbed specific stairs. He never went into certain rooms, even when the job required it, and whenever they left, he always seemed older than when they had entered. Ethan and Margaret met in the late afternoon at the city's small historical archive. The contrast between them was evident. He sought order, dates, justifications. She carried caution, long pauses, and a trained eye for what was not written. The documents she authorized weren't the most obvious ones. They were secondary lists, repeated payments to workers not listed in official records, constant purchases of wood and glass during periods when the house should have already been completed, medical expenses associated with names that disappeared shortly afterward. Among the documents, Ethan found indirect references to nightly meetings inside the house, non-religious, unofficial, private meetings described only as necessary for maintaining balance. No further details. The secondary characters in the house's history began to emerge with unsettling clarity. Employees who abruptly resigned, architects replaced without explanation, relatives who moved into the house and rarely left again. They all left short, interrupted traces. The antagonism between Ethan and Margaret was not declared. He wanted total access, transparency, closure. She believed that certain structures only remained stable as long as they were not completely understood. For Margaret, the house had not been built out of eccentricity, but as a response, a continuous response to something that never ceased. That night, Ethan decided to stay in the house, not out of defiance, but out of pragmatism. I needed to make progress on the work. Even so, as he walked through the corridors lit only by old lamps, he had the distinct impression that the space reacted to his presence differently than it had during the day. Doors that had remained open were now closed. A corridor seemed longer, the air heavier. It wasn't fear, it was adaptation. The house, little by little, seemed to be learning who he was. Ethan's first night in the house wasn't marked by abrupt events or obvious scares. The conflict began more subtly, almost administratively, as if the structure itself were imposing invisible limits on what he could or could not do. At dawn, he realized that some of the notes he had taken the previous night were incomplete. They hadn't been erased or torn up. They simply ended abruptly, as if he himself had interrupted his train of thought mid-sentence. Ethan reviewed the audio recordings he had made to record quick observations. Some were corrupted. Others contained only the ambient sounds of the house, creaks, crackles, an almost regular rhythm, similar to distant footsteps. He tried to rationalize it: technical glitches, fatigue, an old environment interfering with the equipment. Still, he decided to change his strategy. He started working during the day, avoiding the upper floors and prioritizing rooms near the entrance. But the house seemed to respond to this decision by creating new obstacles. Stairs that were previously accessible were blocked by furniture he didn't remember seeing there. Interior doors jammed only when he tried to go through them, carrying specific documents. The conflict ceased to be purely psychological when Ethan found a hidden compartment behind a false wall on the second floor. Inside, there were hand-bound notebooks with dates spanning decades. They weren't personal diaries, but technical records written by different people, with distinct handwriting, all describing urgent modifications made to the house. Each notebook mentioned the same problem, using different terms: pressure, echo, accumulation. None of them described exactly what was being contained. They only reinforced the need to keep building, to keep changing, to keep confusing. Ethan took some of this material to the city archives, demanding full access to the denied records from Margaret. For the first time, she didn't try to dissuade him with silence. She showed him documents that had never been digitized, medical reports of nervous breakdowns, death certificates with vague causes, hand-drawn house maps that didn't match the official floor plan. Margaret revealed that conflict always arose when someone tried to organize Winchester House. Classify, finalize, close. Everyone who sought a logical conclusion ended up interrupted, professionally, emotionally, or permanently. The tension between them intensified. Ethan saw in Margaret's attitude a passive complicity stemming from decades of concealment. She, in turn, saw in him the same pattern as before, someone convinced that understanding equaled control. Meanwhile, the house reacted. During a structural inspection, Ethan nearly fell when he opened a door that led directly to the void of the second floor. There were no safety markings, warnings, or makeshift solutions. That door made no sense and had never been sealed. It was as if he were there to test distractions. Other obstacles arose. Interior windows that closed with rusty chains without him touching them, subtle changes in the layout of the corridors, causing him to take longer than usual to return to familiar points. The main conflict solidified on three fronts: Ethan against the house, Ethan against the incomplete history, and Ethan against the collective refusal to name what had been sacrificed there. Secondary characters began to influence the course of the narrative. An elderly former carpenter refused to re-enter the property, but confirmed that the construction work was never intended to expand the space. They were always repairs, emergency adjustments, containment. Each new piece of information did not solve the mystery, it only made it more concrete. Ethan began to feel that he wasn't uncovering an ancient secret, but interfering in a process that was still ongoing, something that didn't belong to the Winchester family's past, but to the present of anyone who stayed there too long. The house didn't react with direct violence. It reacted with obstacles, as if it were waiting for him to make the same mistake as the others, trying to finish something that was never meant to end. As Ethan delved deeper into Winchester House, he realized that the main conflict didn't exist in isolation. Subplots began to emerge, intertwining with his own investigation and amplifying the sense of unease that the house imposed. One of them involved the mansion's former employees. Fragmented accounts indicated that some of them had disappeared without explanation, while others exhibited drastic changes in behavior. There were mentions of nights when workers refused to stay inside the house, and records of farewell letters that were never sent. Each document added a layer of tension. It wasn't just about the building, but about lives that had been shaped and interrupted by it. Margaret, watching Ethan handle these documents, began to uncover subtle clues about the town and its relationship to Winchester House. Small local superstitions, particular architectural details from the period when the mansion was expanded, habits of distant relatives who never visited the house but whose names appeared in bank and medical records. Each detail reinforced the idea that the house was not just a physical place, but a catalyst for almost invisible events, as if amplifying human choices into unexpected consequences. Another subplot unfolded in the hallways themselves. Ethan found a series of doors sealed with old chains, each identified by a worn sign. Warning, do not open, urgent. He tried to force one open, but the latch only partially gave way, revealing a room filled with furniture partially covered by cloths, stacked notebooks, and a faint metallic odor reminiscent of old iron. It was as if the space held fragments of the Winchester family's memory, preserving secrets that no one dared confront. Tensions rose when Margaret shared the story of a private investigator hired by a distant descendant. He had disappeared inside the house, leaving only confused notes about hallways shifting and sounds that seemed to mimic human voices. Ethan, rational and methodical, couldn't ignore this information, but he also couldn't accept it without evidence. The subplot created pressure. The line between the real and the inexplicable became blurred, demanding quick and strategic decisions. Among the secondary characters, the most striking subplot involved a former caretaker who still visited the property at night. He appeared in documentary accounts as someone who understood patterns in the house, almost as if he spoke to it in code. Ethan tried to find him, but each attempt resulted in corridors closing, doors changing places, and echoes that prevented his approach. This interaction suggested that the house possessed its own mechanisms for keeping secrets, and that anyone who tried to bypass them could get lost in its complexities. Another critical element of this phase was the time pressure. City reports indicated that the property was about to be sold, which meant that Ethan had little time to organize the documents and understand what should be preserved. The urgency didn't just come from bureaucracy. It seemed that the house itself accelerated its own dynamics, creating obstacles that forced immediate decisions, tests of patience, and observational skills. The subplots converged in a way that didn't distract from the central conflict, but rather reinforced it. Winchester House was not just a physical inheritance, but a labyrinth of human choices, mistakes, memories, and consequences. Each secondary character, each hidden room, each incomplete document added tension without offering easy answers. The feeling that something was about to be revealed permeated every scene, keeping Ethan in a constant state of alert. By the end of the day, he realized he could no longer separate his investigation from the very presence of the house. Logic and reasoning, which had been sufficient until then, were now challenged by almost imperceptible subtleties, shadows that shifted, sounds that mimicked footsteps, and doors that seemed to move subtly. Each subplot, each detail, increased the pressure, preparing Ethan for a turning point that would soon arrive. The discovery happened almost accidentally. Ethan went up to the attic, a space that until then seemed secondary, ignored in the official blueprints of the house. The beams creaked under his weight, and the air had a damp smell, a mixture of aged wood and iron. He was only trying to organize old boxes, but found a narrow door, hidden by a panel he had never noticed before. Upon opening the door, he found a room filled with covered furniture, scattered papers, and a large table in the center, as if someone had planned to use that space as the headquarters of their own home. But what caught his attention were the walls. Every surface was covered with old photographs, scribbles, lists of names, documents that seemed to have been compiled over decades. They weren't mere administrative records. They were personal, almost obsessive, observations of each person who had lived or worked in the house. In the center of the table, Ethan found a diary, small, bound in worn leather. Leafing through it, he realized it belonged to Sarah Winchester, the family matriarch, but not as historical accounts portrayed it. Here, her personal narrative emerged raw and unfiltered. Her doubts, her obsessions, the constant fear that the house would never be complete. There were dates that coincided with the disappearances of employees, structural changes, and mysterious incidents. She described nightly meetings, adjustments to walls and doors, endless renovations, and mentioned a presence she never named, something she felt watching, following, influencing every decision. The revelation was more than surprising. It was transformative. Ethan realized that Winchester House wasn't just an eccentric building or a poorly documented inheritance. It was a continuous attempt to contain something or someone that escaped the family's understanding. Every incomplete room, every dead-end door, every hallway that led nowhere was part of an elaborate system to maintain an unstable order, a delicate balance. Ethan felt the ground tremble slightly, a crackling sound as if the house were reacting to the presence of someone who was finally beginning to understand its internal logic. It was no longer about organizing documents or validating records. It was about surviving the very story that was unfolding there. When Margaret was informed of what Ethan had found, she revealed additional details that changed everything. She knew of records indicating secret family meetings, files showing attempts to manipulate the house's structure according to signs and patterns invisible to ordinary visitors. There were hidden codes in floorboards, stained glass, and carvings that could only be interpreted by someone willing to follow the matriarch's obsessive reasoning. Suddenly, every obstacle Ethan had faced in the past few days, doors that closed on their own, hallways that changed direction, distant noises, began to make sense. The house wasn't hostile. It was strategic. A labyrinth built of fear, loss, and obsession, designed to protect something that should never be disturbed. The turning point, therefore, was not an external or supernatural event, but the realization that the house's own history was alive. Winchester House didn't need ghosts to be menacing. Its own logic, its secrets, and the obsession of generations of Winchesters created a system of tension that could engulf any unsuspecting intruder. For Ethan, this realization brought a dilemma: continue trying to unravel the secrets of the house or respect invisible boundaries that could define his own survival within that labyrinthine architecture. Every choice now had real weight, and each step forward could have irreversible consequences. The scenario transformed from a bureaucratic challenge into a silent battle where knowledge and caution were the only weapons. The history of Winchester House, until then fragmented, began to become an almost tangible presence, demanding more from Ethan than reasoning. It required courage, instinct, and patience to confront what lurked in the shadows of unfinished walls. After the turning point, Ethan felt the true weight of Winchester House on his every move. It wasn't just the hallways that shifted, nor the doors that seemed to react to his presence. It was the very understanding of the mansion's complexity that left him tense, almost paralyzed at times. Every decision now had a direct impact, as if the house were testing his judgment at every step. The documents he had found began to have an immediate effect. Some information contradicted others, and Ethan realized that the official history of the Winchester family was just the tip of the iceberg. Old secrets were gradually emerging, revealing patterns of obsessive behavior, covered-up incidents, and even accounts of accidents that had never been officially documented. Each discovery amplified his sense of vulnerability. He was no longer dealing only with papers, but with a living narrative that seemed to react to his investigations. Margaret, realizing that Ethan was beginning to decipher parts of the house's logic, changed her approach. From defensive and cautious, she began to act as a silent guide, providing precise information and warning about areas of the mansion that could represent real danger. The relationship between the two evolved, not from friendship, but from a tense alliance. He needed her to survive. She needed him to validate that the house still retained its essence. Meanwhile, small anomalies began to intensify. Shadows stretched out strangely, footsteps echoed through seemingly dead-end corridors. Doors that Ethan had opened minutes before were locked again. There was no direct threat, but the psychological pressure increased with each sign that the house was not passive. It reacted, learned, and imposed limits. Every wrong move could lead him into subtle traps. Falls, corridors that closed in, stairs that creaked unsteadily. Secondary characters also suffered consequences. An elderly carpenter who had initially been cooperative with Ethan withdrew after reporting that, on a previous visit, he had lost track of time and almost gotten lost in one of the labyrinthine corridors. The caretaker, who knew the house's patterns, began to avoid Ethan, leaving cryptic messages about caution and respect for the implicit rules of the place. Each interaction reinforced that the mansion had a memory and that his actions had repercussions in the real world. The discoveries also affected Ethan's own perception of what was true. He found himself questioning not only official records, but also his own logic. The house presented patterns that seemed rational at first glance, but which, when examined closely, revealed intentional inconsistencies. Each answer seemed to generate new questions, and each obstacle revealed new dimensions of complexity. Margaret made it clear that the situation wasn't just about historical investigation. Winchester House had shaped lives, and now, through Ethan, he continued to exert influence. The pressure mounted as he drew closer to uncovering the last layer of the family's secrets. The tension wasn't physical, but psychological. The house proved it could imprison not only bodies, but minds as well. At the end of that day, Ethan sat in the center of the main room, watching the shadows move on the walls. He understood that every choice had direct consequences, that the narrative of the house expanded from his actions, and that his remaining there was not merely a matter of curiosity or duty. It was a silent test, carefully designed by generations of Winchesters. The internal conflict intensified. Ethan knew he was closer to understanding the logic of the house, but he also recognized that each step forward could irreversibly alter his life. He wasn't just investigating the story, he was becoming a part of it. Ethan began to realize that remaining in Winchester House required more than attention to detail. It demanded adaptation, patience, and courage in the face of what seemed impossible to comprehend. Every hallway, every door, every shadow became a test, not only of his logic, but of his mental resilience. The house revealed its limitations, and at the same time provided opportunities to overcome them. He decided to tackle the upper corridors, which he had previously avoided. With old flashlights and growing determination, he began to map each structural change, noting patterns in the doors that closed on their own and the steps that seemed to move. With each attempt, he learned something new. A corridor that once seemed endless could be safely traversed by following a specific sequence. A door that locked itself could be opened if manipulated at precise angles. What seemed chaotic gradually became comprehensible, as if the house itself were teaching those who observed it attentively. Margaret remained by his side, now more as an ally than a restrictive guide. Together, they discovered connections between old documents, secret notebooks, and architectural patterns. Their relationship deepened, based on mutual trust and respect for the tacit knowledge the house demanded. There was no conventional friendship, but there was an alliance grounded in the need for survival and understanding. As he explored the attic and the third floor, Ethan began to recognize the human dimension of the obsession that had shaped the Winchester house. Every carving, every confusing corridor, every architectural adjustment responded to the desperate attempt to protect something or to contain something that the Winchester family could never fully explain. He no longer saw just walls and doors. He saw decisions made out of fear, guilt, and responsibility. Ethan's growth was reflected in his actions. He stopped reacting solely instinctively to obstacles and began to anticipate them, developing his own logic that combined observation and intuition. Every step was calculated, every choice had foreseen consequences. He began to perceive hidden patterns, understanding that the house wasn't trying to harm him, but to teach him how to navigate the complex labyrinth of memories and secrets it carried. Old subplots began to unravel as Ethan understood the house's unspoken rules. The caretaker quietly reappeared, leaving coded instructions that pointed to safe routes. Records of missing employees were contextualized, revealing patterns that prevented greater tragedies. The tension gradually lessened, replaced by a profound understanding. Winchester House functioned as a system, and those who learned its rules could interact with it without being destroyed. This phase also marked Ethan's internal transformation. He stopped seeing the inheritance merely as a bureaucratic task and began to understand the psychological and historical dimension of the Winchester family legacy. His patience became a weapon, his observation an ally, his courage a shield against the silent pressure of the mansion. With each discovery, Ethan not only progressed physically through the house, but also grew stronger emotionally. He began to deal with the anxiety that the house itself provoked, transforming fear into focus, confusion into strategy. He learned to listen to the sounds of the hallways, interpret subtle signs, and predict seemingly random movements. By the end of this phase, Ethan was no longer just a visitor to Winchester House. He had become an active participant, capable of interacting with the mansion consciously, respecting its secrets and understanding its patterns. This transformation was crucial. Without it, the climax of the story could never have been addressed with clarity and effectiveness. In the days that followed, overcoming the internal challenges of Winchester House, Ethan began to feel the mansion's presence more intensely, almost palpably. It wasn't a direct threat, but a silent awareness that seemed to observe his every step, evaluating his choices, testing his persistence. Each corridor that had previously represented only an obstacle became a strategic step. Ethan needed to calculate movements, anticipate the structure's reactions, and understand how each space influenced his next steps. Margaret became a silent observer, helping him decipher patterns without revealing everything at once. The tension between them had transformed. There was no longer antagonism, but a cautious collaboration marked by understanding glances and calculated pauses. She provided subtle clues about hidden doors, corridors, and compartments, while Ethan applied his observations to avoid mistakes. This silent synchronicity became vital to facing what was to come. While exploring the second and third floors, Ethan found subtle signs that hinted at impending events. Old papers mentioned nighttime meetings, last-minute adjustments, and markings indicating quick movements, often by a single person. He realized these notes weren't just historical records, but implicit instructions on how to interact with the house without provoking dangerous reactions. Each detail prepared the ground for the climax, the moment when all the secrets would be confronted directly. Previously, secondary subplots began to solidify. documents from missing employees, records of emergency repairs, and scattered accounts aligned, offering clues about the house's true purpose. Ethan realized that every physical obstacle, doors that closed on their own, corridors that changed direction, was intimately linked to preserving a secret that should never be revealed. Time pressure mounted. The sale of the property was approaching, and every decision needed to be precise, quick, and definitive. The tension was also heightened by Ethan's awareness of his own vulnerability. He wasn't just facing a labyrinthine structure, but the living history of a family marked by obsession, loss, and fear. Every wrong step could not only delay his goal, but alter his own life trajectory. The walls now seemed to whisper, and the steps creaked with a rhythm that mimicked heartbeats, reinforcing the feeling that every action had weight. The protagonist began organizing his resources, detailed maps of the attic, photographs of the doors, records of movement patterns. He combined observation with intuition, learning to interpret subtle signs and react before obstacles arose. Margaret, silent, provided only essential alerts, reinforcing the need for mutual trust and precision. Each subplot was tied together to create a state of maximum tension. Labyrinthine corridors, hidden doors, historical documents, missing employees, old markings, and Winchester family records converged, preparing Ethan for the final confrontation. He knew the climax would be not only physical but psychological, a test that would demand profound understanding, courage, and patience. By the end of this stage, Ethan was ready. He understood the house's logic, knew its patterns, had solved secondary subplots, and was aware of the risk. The climax was approaching, and every future decision would be crucial, not only for the outcome of his investigation, but for his survival inside Winchester House. The moment arrived like a sudden compression of time and space. Ethan strode down the main hallway, flashlights in hand, old documents strapped to his body, each step calculated. The shadows cast by the stained glass windows stretched, swirled, seemed to touch the walls and then recede as if the house itself breathed around him. The tension that had built up in the previous days had reached its peak. Every corridor, every door, every creak seemed amplified, and Winchester House seemed alive in an almost conscious way. In the center of the second floor, Ethan found what appeared to be the core of the mansion. A circular room with no visible doors, just a continuous wall covered in photographs, notebooks, carvings, and symbols. It was as if the family's history was concentrated in that single space, a mixture of obsession, memory, and silent warning. That's when he realized he wasn't alone. Ethan sensed someone's presence behind him. Not a supernatural being, but an intense psychological effect. The house itself made him aware of his loneliness, amplifying every sound, every shadow. Margaret appeared silently, her presence offering balance, but also tension. She didn't come as a guide, she came as a witness to what needed to be faced. Ethan began examining the room, noticing patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. The lists of names, the drawings of doors and hallways, the dates of incidents, everything aligned. He realized that the architecture of the house itself was not random, but a physical representation of the Winchester family's obsessions and fears. Every wall adjustment, every incomplete hallway, every dead-end door was a response to an invisible presence, an attempt to contain something that could not be named. When he tried to open a central compartment, a loud bang echoed through the house, doors creaked and windows trembled. The psychological pressure reached its peak. Ethan felt as if he were crossing a threshold. Either he fully understood the logic of the mansion, or he would be swallowed by it. He took a deep breath, applied everything he had learned in the last few days, observation, patience, pattern interpretation, and manipulated the elements of the room with almost surgical precision. The compartment opened. Inside, Ethan found what no one expected: detailed records of all the extreme measures taken by the family to contain what they called the echo, a presence that could not be destroyed, only kept under control. There were letters, diagrams, meticulous calculations of each expansion, each additional door, each winding corridor. The truth was clear. Winchester House was not cursed, nor haunted by spirits, but rather by decades of obsession and fear, materialized in the architecture itself. The instant Ethan understood this, he felt a subtle shift in the air. The shadows softened, the creaks lessened. The pressure in the house didn't disappear, but it seemed to acknowledge that he had reached an understanding. Margaret, silent, simply nodded. The maximum tension had been faced, and the truth, however disturbing, was finally in sight. The climax wasn't explosive or conventionally dramatic. It was psychological, strategic, and revealing. Ethan realized that conquering Winchester House didn't mean altering its structure or confronting ghosts, but understanding its logic, respecting its patterns, and accepting the human complexity that had shaped that building. He had overcome the deepest challenge, dealing with the living legacy of the Winchester family's obsession without being consumed by it. When he left the room, the corridors seemed less intimidating. The house was still labyrinthine, still complex, but now there was a balance between observation, understanding, and action. Ethan had gained not only information, but an insight that few had managed to achieve. Winchester House continued its labyrinthine existence, but he had learned to navigate it without losing his own sanity. In the days following the climax, Ethan realized that Winchester House continued to exert its effect on all who came near it, but that his own journey had changed his relationship with the place. He no longer saw the mansion merely as a physical labyrinth, but as a tangible reflection of human decisions, fears, and obsessions. Each corridor, each door, and each room now carried a meaning that transcended architecture. They were chapters in a decades-long narrative, intertwining lives, losses, and difficult choices. Ethan began organizing the documents and records he had discovered, compiling them into a coherent file. Each piece of information now made sense, not in isolation, but together, forming a complete picture of the Winchester family's history and the extreme measures they had taken to deal with what they called the Echo, a force of fear and obsession transformed into living architecture. Margaret, in turn, helped to contextualize details that still remained obscure. Her initial caution gave way to effective collaboration. Together, they decided that certain information should be preserved for future research, while other elements of the story could remain private, as the very spirit of the house demanded. The mutual understanding of limits and responsibilities marked the end of a tense but necessary phase. Ethan reflected on how the experience had changed his perception of investigation and interpretation of reality. He understood that Winchester House didn't need supernatural mysteries to be impressive. Its own complexity, born from human obsession and fear, was enough to challenge any mind. More importantly, he realized that respecting those limits was as vital as seeking the truth. The town surrounding the mansion began to observe Ethan with curiosity and respect. The narrative that had once seemed like folklore now had the backing of detailed records, and his work shed light on events that were previously only rumors or incomplete stories. Winchester House remained enigmatic and imposing, but the tension that hung over those who tried to understand its entirety had lessened, at least for those who, like Ethan, had learned to read its signs. On an emotional level, Ethan experienced a profound transformation. The anxiety and pressure he had felt confronting the labyrinthine logic of the house were replaced by a state of calm attention and respect. He had overcome not only physical and structural challenges, but also the psychological tension imposed by years of obsession and isolation. Ultimately, the story of Winchester House didn't end with easy answers. It remained a living monument to human complexity, to the choices that shape lives, and to the consequences that perpetuate over time. Ethan learned that sometimes true power lies not in uncovering all secrets, but in understanding the limits of what can be faced without losing one's own essence. The conclusion showed that the balance between knowledge, patience, and respect for the unknown was key to dealing with complex and seemingly impossible situations. Winchester House remained a silent witness, but now, for Ethan, it was also a symbol of overcoming, growth, and profound understanding. Months later, Ethan revisited Winchester House, but not as an investigator or an intruder. He walked the corridors with familiarity, recognizing patterns and details that had previously seemed impossible to comprehend. The mansion remained labyrinthine, dark and complex, but he no longer felt pressured or lost. Margaret stayed in touch, sending reports of small structural changes and newly discovered documents. They understood that the house would never be fully deciphered, but that didn't matter. The learning, the overcoming, and the understanding that Ethan had gained were enough to maintain his balance and respect the memory of the Winchester family. As he walked away for the last time, Ethan gazed at the imposing facade and felt a strange mixture of reverence and serenity. Winchester House still held its secrets, but he had found his own way through the labyrinth. The story wasn't over, but his personal journey had reached a point of clarity that few could attain. If you were captivated by the story of Winchester House, share your impressions and theories about the secrets that may still be hidden. Every detail, every corridor, and every record that Ethan discovered is just a part of what this complex and mysterious mansion has to reveal. Tell us in the comments which discoveries caught your attention the most, which patterns you would have tried to decipher first, or even what you would do if you were in his place. If you enjoyed the story, share it with friends who appreciate true mysteries, enigmatic constructions, and narratives that challenge the perception of reality. Winchester House still holds its mysteries, but now, together, we can reflect on what it means to confront the unknown, understand complexities, and respect boundaries, both those of history and those of the human mind itself.